General Hospital spoilers reveal that one of the biggest shocks quietly spreading through Port Charles doesn't come from the spotlight or the glamorous gowns at the nurses' ball, but from a name many thought had been forgotten: Scott. News of his unexpected return right after the lavish event is over is creating an atmosphere so tense it's almost suffocating. This isn't a nostalgic or emotional return. This is the brutal realignment of an underground order that has been teetering for days. The people behind the scenes, those who thought they were safe behind the glimmering lights and applause, are now beginning to tremble as they realize Scott isn't back to attend, he's back to tear it all down. The fact that Scott chose the exact moment the nurses' ball ends to return is no coincidence. It's a silent yet ruthless strategy. Throughout the event, everyone was consumed with image, fame, and perfectly orchestrated performances meant to polish their public personas. But when the lights go down, when the masks come off, that's when the truth becomes the most vulnerable. And it's then that Scott's appearance will act like a knife, shredding everything that's been covered by fake facades. He's not back to reclaim a position, but to remind everyone that he never truly left. He's been waiting for the right moment to become someone no one can ignore anymore. With a past filled with schemes, failures, betrayals, and unhealed wounds, Scott is the embodiment of everything Port Charles wants to forget, but never truly can. He knows every corner of this town, who owes who lied to whom, and who is silently deceiving themselves. While the powerful figures of the moment are busy crafting their public images, Scott, with his silent observation, has gathered enough ammunition to shake every foundation in place. And as the rumors of his return spread, one thing is certain: no one feels safe anymore. Lucy, who runs the nurses' ball with her bright smile, can no longer hide the anxious look in her eyes when Scott's name is mentioned. Mina and Drew, the hosts of the red carpet, suddenly become more reserved when asked about the post-ball events. Carly, Sunny, and even Ava, all those who seemed unrelated, feel a subtle tremor. Because they know Scott never does anything without a purpose. And this time, that purpose is definitely not simple. One of the scariest things is, no one knows what Scott is holding. Is it a recording? A financial secret? A staged event? Or a series of hidden connections once buried to protect the key players' images? Scott's silence is what makes everyone the most unsettled. He doesn't need to speak, his mere presence is enough to turn every guess upside down. Everyone is asking themselves, am I the target? And if not, who is next? Scott's return is also making fragile relationships even more dangerous. Underground alliances are beginning to crack under suspicion. Personal relationships are now under a magnifying glass. Because everyone knows, once Scott decides to act, he won't strike head-on. He'll infiltrate from within, through words, through glances, through stories brought up at the right time and in the right way. No one dares to say it aloud, but everyone in Port Charles knows one thing: this year's nurses' ball won't end when the music fades. It has only just begun. And the key holder to the second chapter of this tragedy is Scott, the man everyone thought had been forgotten, now rewriting the script of the game. A game with no room for innocence, and certainly no room for the sweet lies wrapped in sparkling gowns. Because Scott doesn't need the stage lights to shine, he just needs the right moment to make everyone bow their heads. And that moment is right after the nurses' ball. The story of Scott secretly teaming up with Mina to target Drew is increasingly moving beyond the realm of a personal conflict, turning into a dangerous undercurrent quietly spreading throughout Port Charles, shaking not only the fragile power structure but also reaching every link in the web of complex relationships and once secure alliances. This unexpected move is a brutal realignment, a backlash after a series of compressed events, triggering a chain reaction of psychological, political, emotional, and media pressure. Now, the situation isn't simply about winners and losers, but about who will have the strength to stand after the storm passes. Scott, once considered a peripheral figure, overshadowed by the dust of the past and his dull presence in power games, has chosen the perfect time to return, not to save anyone, but to prove that he never truly left the chessboard. Beneath his optimistic, humorous exterior, Scott is a skilled player, a lawyer who knows that the law isn't a barrier, but a tool. Meanwhile, Nina, the woman always torn between the desire to be loved and the need to control, is entering a completely different phase. She no longer wants to be the one forgiven. She wants to be the one who no longer has to apologize. And Drew is the one standing between her and that goal. The partnership between Nina and Scott is a dangerous handshake between repressed emotions and strategic intellect once underestimated. They don't need to act hastily. Because people like Drew are the ones most likely to make mistakes, those who think they're in a safe position, with Carly's backing, company stock, and public reputation. But they've forgotten that those things, power, image, relationships, are the easiest targets to manipulate if someone knows how to distort the truth at the right time, leak the right information, and activate unresolved past relationships. Nina's plan doesn't begin with a direct attack. She doesn't need to expose Drew in front of the press. She doesn't need to say anything at all. She just needs to plant seeds of doubt within Drew's circle, between him and Carly, between him and the stakeholders who once trusted him, between him and his allies who are quietly waiting to see if he can maintain stability. Meanwhile, Scott, with his deep understanding of ELQ's legal structure, is slowly exploiting Drew's weaknesses through indirect legal actions, questioning the legality of certain deals, bringing up old, forgotten accusations, or even initiating a covert investigation designed to make Drew lose temporary control. Port Charles is beginning to react. Characters who once seemed unrelated are starting to feel the pressure. Carly is becoming more cautious, knowing Nina never acts alone without a long-term plan. Willow is starting to waver, not because of her trust in Drew, but because of the frightening resurgence of Michael and now the subtle wave from Nina. Those who thought they were on the outside, like Olivia or Valentine, are now forced to pick a side. Because they know, if they don't act, they'll be the next ones consumed. The oppression that Nina and Scott are creating doesn't come from an order. It comes from a feeling of being watched, manipulated, and pulled into a game where the rules aren't announced. And that's what makes it so haunting. Drew, a man who once had control, is now confused, angry, and beginning to act recklessly. He tries to find allies, but doors are starting to close. People are still smiling, still shaking hands, but in their eyes, there's doubt. Because everyone feels one thing. Drew is about to lose everything, and they don't want to be swept along. What makes the whole plan even more insane is its quiet nature. No one is shouting. No one is declaring war. Just small actions, one file unexpectedly appearing on the court desk, an anonymous text to shareholders, a meeting cancelled for no clear reason, but they are slowly tightening the noose around Drew. Every time he reacts, Nina and Scott take a step back, letting him unravel himself, ruin his image, destroy his trust. The story is shifting from a fight for justice to a mental hunt. Drew is not just losing his position, he is slowly losing himself. And Port Charles, like so many times in the past, is standing on the sidelines, observing, cautious, waiting to see who will be left standing after the storm. But this time, it isn't a mafia, or a public villain, causing the upheaval. It's a wounded woman. And a man who was once left behind, now together rewriting the definition of revenge in silence. And in that silence, every obsession is being ignited, and no one will escape without paying the price. Port Charles is trembling from an unprecedented aftershock. The Nurses' Ball 2025 event, which was supposed to be a night honoring art and philanthropy, ended not with applause or exuberant congratulations, but with a chilling silence that enveloped the grand hall, a place that only moments before had been alive with music and the rhythmic footsteps on the red carpet. And all of this began with one person, Scott. No one expected the man who had been pushed out of the town's political and social spotlight to be the one carrying the real bombshell. Timing his strike perfectly as everyone else had lowered their guard, delivering a fatal blow that could shatter the entire structure of power and trust within the community. The secret Scott revealed was not the kind of rumor circulating in the hallways or blurry photos in tabloids. It was a series of documents, legal evidence, testimonies. and recorded conversations that had been quietly collected over the course of more than a year. It had been waiting for the right moment to be exposed. And the nurses' ball's closing night was the perfect stage. While guests were exchanging compliments, admiring Lucy's radiant beauty, Trina's powerful voice, and Jocelyn's unexpected performance, Scott stepped up to the podium, without needing the spotlight or a flashy microphone. All he needed was silence, and he had it. All eyes were on him as he pulled a thick file from his jacket pocket and held it up high, to the astonishment of those who had once viewed Drew as a symbol of trust. What was the secret? It was a series of embezzlement activities involving ELQ's charity funds, disguised under the guise of financing public health initiatives in South America. But in reality, the funds had been laundered and funneled back into personal accounts through front companies, some of which were linked to individuals with a history of international fraud. Scott didn't just have numbers, he had audio recordings of internal meetings, deleted emails that had been recovered through a technician he hired, everything he needed to trap Drew with no escape. As Scott read aloud the figures, the names of those involved, and the suspicious transfers, no one could deny it any longer. Drew had become tangled in a web of lies far worse than anyone had imagined. Then, as if it were a storm programmed to hit, the police walked in. Still in his suit, smelling faintly of the evening's perfume, Drew was handcuffed in front of hundreds of onlookers, some sympathetic, some gleeful, and some simply terrified. Willow cried out in shock, unable to find the words. Carly stood frozen, unable to move, her legs locked in place. Nina, watching from afar, didn't smile, nor did she show any emotion. But her eyes lit up with the glow of someone who had finally witnessed justice after years of suffering. Sonny, though not directly involved, felt a tremor deep within. He understood. This was an indirect message that no one was invulnerable. The event immediately set off a chain reaction. ELQ shareholders panicked, and the stock price plummeted. Carly faced an onslaught of calls from the board, the media, and investors demanding that she take responsibility. Willow had to cancel her work schedule at the hospital and was summoned to clarify her connection to the funds previously deposited into a joint account. Michael, who had just returned with a cold, calculating demeanor, now found himself in a state of suspicion. Had his return inadvertently triggered this disaster? Or was he the next target of Scott's? But the one person who remained completely silent was Scott. He didn't speak another word after handing the file over to the police. He simply nodded and walked away, as if he had just fulfilled a sacred duty. And indeed, for him, this was not just a personal act of revenge. It was a statement that he was still in the game. That he, the man everyone thought had faded from the spotlight, could still control the fate of those who once ridiculed him. Port Charles would never be the same. The nurses' ball may have ended, but the cracks it left behind would echo for years, even decades. Those who thought they had won now had to rebuild from the ashes. Those who had once stood on the sidelines were rising as the keepers of the truth. And Drew, innocent or not, had lost the one thing that mattered most, the community's trust. In this town, the truth was never just the truth. It was a weapon. And Scott had proved it by choosing the most beautiful moment to bring everything crashing down. From here on out, no one, not even those who thought themselves safest, could sleep soundly. Because if Drew could be arrested right at the nurses' ball, who would be next? And who was holding the secret still buried? Scott was pouring all his mind and strategy into a single goal, to retain Nina's trust. In his eyes, Nina wasn't just a valuable strategic ally, but the final symbol of connection. Of a fragile trust that he couldn't afford to lose after all the losses life had thrown his way. From the moment he chose to side with Nina in the battle against Drew, Scott had committed. Not just with action but with his own honor, something he rarely gave to anyone. But now, as the plan was almost complete and all paths seemed to lead to an underground victory for both of them, a figure from the past suddenly reappeared, carrying a mystery powerful enough to make everything unravel: Lisel. Lisel's return was unannounced. No one knew where she had been during the recent chaos, nor did anyone expect her to appear just as everything was tipping in Nina and Scott's favor. But the surprise wasn't in her presence, it was in the look she carried. It was no longer pure anger, nor was it contempt or hatred, but a frightening kind of stillness. As if she knew something that no one else had ever thought of. And that stillness, immediately, like a dangerous catalyst, began to destabilize the fragile balance Scott had carefully built. Scott, though always confident and in control, felt a tremor for the first time in years. Lisel was the only one still alive who knew the things he had tried to hide, even from Nina. The old years. The shady dealings, the calculations he thought had been buried, now, they were all at risk of being exposed with a single glance from Lisel. She didn't need to threaten him. Her presence alone was enough to serve as a warning. And Scott, who had once thought himself to be in control, now found himself on the defensive, not against Drew, but against a woman he had once believed would never return. Meanwhile, Nina began to feel that something was wrong. Scott had grown more secretive, no longer sharing his next steps as he had before. She sensed that he was hiding something, not out of betrayal, but out of fear. And in Nina's world, there was no place for fear. She needed the person by her side to be strong, to be honest. To be ready to fight to the end, not someone hiding the truth to protect her from things she had the right to know. This shift in Scott's behavior began to sow doubt in Nina. Was Scott protecting her? Or was he using her as a shield to keep the things Lisel might expose from coming to light? The mystery Lisel carried had yet to be revealed, but it was clearly present in every interaction. Every moment of silence she created in the room full of lights but full of darkness as well. Every look she gave Scott felt like a dagger plunging into his weaknesses. She didn't need to say much. Because she knew that it was silence that terrified Scott the most. And Port Charles, still reeling from Drew's arrest, was now stirring with the possibility of a new earthquake, not from a financial scandal, but from a past that had never been fully unearthed. With Lisel as the keeper of the key and Scott as the one trying to keep the door from being opened. The obsession began to creep into every action Scott made. He became restless. Often canceling meetings with Nina, even being spotted standing alone in the shadows after City Hall, as if talking to ghosts no one else could see. Lisel didn't need to threaten him, she just needed to wait, because she knew that Scott would unravel if he couldn't control himself. And that was slowly becoming a reality. A man like Scott, who had survived by his sharp mind, by his ability to manipulate situations, was now being ruled by his emotions, all because of a woman he couldn't face. All of this was driving Port Charles toward a new explosion. Nina felt betrayed. Lisel kept her deadly silence. Scott was confused and conflicted. And while all of this was unfolding, people like Carly, Sunny, and Willow were starting to pay attention. Because they understood, if Lisel had returned, there was definitely a reason. And if Scott was trembling over something, it was no longer just his problem. This was a ticking bomb, and when it explodes, it will pull more than one person down with it. Because in Port Charles, no secret stays buried forever. And when the keeper of secrets returns, the one who's lied the longest will be the first to shatter. Scott knew that. And he was living every second in the dread that the moment was coming, sooner than anyone dared to imagine. Nina's victory over Drew was not just a temporary finish line in a personal battle, but a complete reshaping of the power dynamics in Port Charles, a town where power games never truly end, they only change hands. As Nina systematically took Drew down. Not with brute force or loud events, but through strategy, patience, and razor-sharp psychological blows, she proved that sometimes the weakest and most deeply wounded are the ones capable of changing the entire game. And the moment Drew was handcuffed and dragged out of the grand hall of the nurses' ball, with the stage lights dimming, was an unspoken declaration that Nina had become a real force to be reckoned with. That victory, though unaccompanied by applause, echoed throughout the silence of the town. Those who had once mocked Nina's efforts now eyed her with caution. Those who had shaken their heads when she appeared weak, shedding tears for love and family, now silently avoided her gaze as though it were an invisible blade. Because they knew, Nina was no longer the woman pushed out of Carly's world. No longer the one abandoned by Sunny, no longer a shadow lost among larger-than-life figures. She had been reborn from the worst of things. And now she held power, a power that didn't rely on violence to survive but on calculation and strategy. But the price of victory was isolation. Since Drew's fall, the doors that had once been wide open to Nina began to close. Not because they opposed her, but because they feared her. They feared someone who could go so far, so quietly, and so precisely that a businessman, once the head of ELQ and backed by Carly and Willow, could be brought to his knees. Ava began to distance herself. Valentine became unpredictable. Even neutral figures like Olivia no longer felt comfortable sitting with Nina at a party. Because now, Nina was not just the woman who had won, she had become a symbol of the unpredictable. And in Port Charles, the unpredictable is more terrifying than any weapon. And then, a series of unanswered questions began to emerge. Was Drew truly guilty? Or was he a victim of a sophisticated setup? Did Nina manipulate the evidence herself, or did she simply take advantage of the truth at the perfect moment? And if she could do that to Drew, who would be next? Willow? Sunny? Carly? Or even those who had once sided with her? These questions transformed Nina's victory into no longer just a triumph, but a lever pulling her into a labyrinth with no exit. The media began to divide. Some praised Nina as the strongest woman Port Charles had ever known. A new icon of feminism and rising after injustice. But others quietly started to piece together her past, the Crimson takeover, her complicated relationship with Valentine, the incident that cost Willow custody of Wiley, and now the fall of Drew. They didn't need a clear conclusion, just the suggestion that Nina was behind all the chaos. And in a town that thrives on sensationalism, Nina quickly became the center of conspiracy theories, the dangerous beautiful woman, the one with a knife hidden in the hem of her gown. Capable of anything if pushed to the limit. Nina realized this. She felt the stares, no longer respectful, but probing. The hugs, no longer warm, but coldly polite. The compliments, no longer genuine, but laced with hidden meaning. She entered a meeting room and knew they were talking about her before she even stepped in. She said one thing, and it would be interpreted 10 different ways. She made a decision, and no matter how reasonable it was, it would be doubted. Nina had reached the pinnacle. But there was no one there waiting for her. Only the wind, cold, solitary, and always carrying the whispers of unspoken accusations. Port Charles was no longer a battlefield between two great powers, it was a network of fears, regrets, and suspicions. And Nina, though standing at the center, was no longer the only one in control. She was part of a larger, more dangerous system, where every action was remembered, every word analyzed, and every victory had its cost. The obsession began when she realized she couldn't sleep in peace, not because her conscience was biting her, but because she knew someone else was also calculating how to turn the tide. And if Nina had done it to Drew, someone else could do the same to her. And so, another question began to form in Nina's mind, growing louder with every sleepless night. Had she truly won, or was she just the next one in the crosshairs of an endless game? In Port Charles, victory is never the end. It's only the beginning of a new chapter, one where those who have reached the highest peak are the ones who must cling to the railing the hardest. Because one slip, and everything will come crashing down without warning.